Good afternoon, everyone. And before I start, let me acknowledge the lands that we are on right now. So, the land that I'm standing on today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Welcome. And actually, I'm reminded of what was spoken about yesterday. And I've been trying, I've been struggling, and I'm sure you as well, that we also have to acknowledge that we are the uninvited guests, although not unwelcome. And I think it is the space, that in between space, that we also have to kind of explore to see the kind of systemic oppression that people of color face, especially anti Black racism. But currently, or rather concurrently, it is also the anti Indigenous peoples' racism. So before we actually delve into that, I'm gonna let me see if the slides work. I'm gonna seek help from the tech help because I do not see attendees right now. I have no idea why not, because my screen is too big and I cannot fathom how many attendees there are or what their questions are gonna be. So if you could help me with that.
Deep, we actually have about 25 people so far.
Okay, but I need to see if they have a question or an issue. Where do I see? I don't see a tab giving me that offer.
Right in the Q&A area. So
Okay,
there's a
so what I
Q&A
see
tab
is
there.
just the slides. So can I do the side by side mode and then I can see the Q&A? No, I don't see it. Anyways, so you're going to help me whenever there is a question because I believe that is some kind of an issue. So as we are, tackling the technical issues, I'm just going to start the presentation. But before I start the conversation, I'm going to ask you to actually respond to two questions. Question number one, and then question number two. I'll give about a couple of minutes for each question. Very simple responses, yes or no. And to get to the questions, now, you see the active poll, you will see an engage tab on the top of your screen. And the question is very simple. Do you believe in a multicultural Canada? A yes or no? Oh, that is 3 responses so far. Couple of minutes. We have 25 people. And so just about 6 responses. I think I can move or again, if anybody is having a trouble with finding the engage tab, which is on the top of your screen, 7 responses. I think yes, people. If again, Jake, if you see somebody with difficulties, you can let me know.
Of course.
Thank you so much. Because I don't see the chat options. This is All right, I think I can move on to the, oh, no, we're getting some more responses. Maybe another minute? Yeah, people are beginning to pick up. So I move on. Thank you very much. The second question is, oh, there it is. I actually see it now. Thank you. So let me go to the second question. Has multiculturalism been effective in your agency's programming? It's a convoluted way of asking, but has it been effective? Another 30 seconds or so. We have roughly 8 respondents. All right. I move on. So, yeah, 9 responses. The 9 that came first time, 9 this time. All right. So, the first question, we kind of overwhelmingly do believe in a multicultural Canada, and we believe that, again, about 67%, that multiculturalism has been effective in our agency's programming. I used to think similarly I mean, I had a similar kind of a viewpoint way before I moved to Canada because I was viewing it only from a theoretical perspective. Anyways, now what is the point of multiculturalism? And I'm going to be honest. As I was reading and preparing for this presentation, I was reminded of what my family used to say, and I think they continue saying that whenever my kids, and only when they were young, not now, they would ask me a question or they would ask me to clarify something or explain a meaning of something, they said that they would actually get an hour-long explanation or the not exactly just the definition, but the history, the origin, and the various stages that phrase or that particular word had gone through. And they said that by the end of it, they actually forgot what they had asked me, or they were more confused at the end of it. So while I was jotting down points for this presentation, I thought I was going exactly on that track. What I'm trying to say is that at the end of this presentation, there is a high likelihood that you would not know what my original topic was, or you absolutely did not learn anything new or valuable. So apologies for that. But while I was also trying to work through that and trying to think, how can I make any kind of a valuable input for my colleagues who are more experienced and certainly have more knowledge than what I have. I had this, and I, sometimes just like saying that I had this epiphany. And that was that this time around, I'm going to disrupt and dismantle the traditional hegemony of a presenter and attendees. I've those who know me know that I've spent about, my past life teaching in a university, and theoretically, we always do talk about disrupting structures because it's only through disrupting or dismantling structures. This morning's conversation was also around that. It's only through that that we actually are able to reimagine things. And we can't dismantle structures if there is a voice that purports to be more knowledgeable, has something uh, that stands at a higher pedestal, and everybody listening to that person, they do not. So my epiphany was that I'm going to be the one who sow the seeds of doubt. I'm going to be the one who's probably just going to dismantle and hope that my colleagues find better answers and solutions. And I also thought that if we do not look into, because the whole process of dismantling something needs that we look at its foundations, and foundations are the philosophical thoughts behind it. So I thought that I would actually just, and there are going to be many philosophical and policy and political and social um, terminologies that I will be talking about, but briefly touching upon them, that we are going to go a little bit in depth into that so that we disrupt and see what actually comes out of it. We need to, and I think it's very important to actually dismantle all of that, because what happens is that we hear these terms: multiculturalism, neoliberalism, post-colonialism, anti-racism, and we almost become numb to to what these things mean. Because if it had not been the case, then why would it need for us to actually watch a video of almost 9 minutes of a Black person being killed by a uniformed police officer? It was a 9 minute long video. We don't need to be woken up to to systemic racism only because we saw a video of a person being, the life being snuffed out almost torturously. It is, it was the brutal callousness of a dehumanizing system represented by a police officer. Then we find out, actually, quite a few months later, that a Black woman was killed sleeping in her house, in her apartment, by a monstrosity called no knock warrant. And all we have to do is look within ourselves in Canada, not just something that is happening in USA, but in Canada, where two people in our recent history who all they required was a mental health checkup, but they ended up dying. And then, of course, the police officer ended up being acquitted by the courts. That's a system. And then the, of course, I can go on and on. The RCMP's attitude towards what is happening in Nova Scotia, where the indigenous people have a right to fish during. It's a treaty. It is a pact that Canada has made with indigenous people. But that is the kind of callousness that we have. And I think we are all equally responsible for the way these things have come up. The way the structures are functioning right now. So my sincere effort today is going to be that I want to disrupt these structures by decoding and critiquing the philosophies and ideologies that were either concurrent or fed into defining multiculturalism, because these are very contested terms. We use them to a point of creating a meaninglessness. So, and trust me, this is by no means an exhaustive explanation of either of these terms, because trust me, these terms have been critiqued, coded, decoded, explained, researched, and so on for the past almost 6 decades. And the universities and these departments of humanities and philosophy and even government policymakers, they've done a whole lot of that. So I won't even be able to actually give you a definition. And I'm not kidding. The reason I say that I won't be able to give you a definition of these terms is that each of these terms have a definition in the dictionary of philosophy that runs into pages. So it's barely, a kind of point tip kind of look at these terminologies, which I hope when you go back into looking at it and then thinking in terms of, do we really need multiculturalism, or in what form do we need multiculturalism? So hopefully the few minutes that I spend on each of these terms below will be enough to show the schisms and fissures of these concurrent philosophies. Because if you have a fissure or a crack within these terminologies and they've fed into defining what multiculturalism is, then inherently the structure and the foundation of multiculturalism is very weak. It's brittle. It's going to fall apart, or it's going to mask the systemic racism and oppression that we continue to see around us. Now, this the first term that we're going to talk about is multicultural or multiculturalism, or how do we approach multiculturalism? What do we make of it, and how do we understand that? The practice of multiculturalism in modern liberal democracies it it has been hampered by a clear definition of racism and anti-racism, as well as the confusion about the role of multiculturalism in addressing the disadvantages and combating racism. This lack of clarity has contributed to a marginalization of anti racism within multiculturalism. So it gets so obfuscated that, in fact, the whole point of anti racism gets um, it gets muddled and it gets marginalized. Now, Lenton, one of the scholars, had noted that a multicultural approach to living together in the diverse societies of the post war Western world was built on ways of conceptualizing and suggesting solutions to racism. So Lenton says that, of course, when this term was first started to be to be used, it was imagined in a way that it would function as a system that would work towards anti-racist policies. However, it didn't end up happening, and why, we will see. And as such, any discussion of multiculturalism, according to him, needs to reference its anti-racist potential. And it is just a potential because it never ended up happening. Now, a more holistic view of this definition was given by UNESCO, which defines multiculturalism as three separate but interconnected phenomena. First, multiculturalism can be seen as a description of the demographic makeup of a society. That means if there are people that are coming from Africa, people coming from Asia, people from Europe, and they are different cultures, so it is a demographic makeup. It's almost like a descriptive understanding of what multiculturalism is. Second, interestingly, it can be conceived as a set of norms or principles that uphold the right of all individuals to equal access and ability to participate in social, cultural, economic, and political life. I'm sure a lot of you, when you look at that, especially the second part of the UNESCO definition or explanation, we think of all our programming and even a lot of our own values that we put up on our websites, that we live by as settlement agencies. This is what we are functioning under, this whole notion of equal access, equal participation, ability to participate in social, cultural, and economic and political life. And finally, UNESCO says that multiculturalism can be seen as a government strategy. And we do see it in Canada because in in 70s we decided to call ourselves a multicultural nation. And what are those policies? Um, those policies are almost like interventions when the government needs to come in and see whether all groups, all different cultures are getting equal access to services, are actually being serviced. So finally, multiculturalism can be seen as a government strategy. Now, the first definition describes a situation. The second one is it almost articulates the values and rights related to this situation. And the third describes its implementation in policy and practice. Now, values and rights assigned to a multicultural situation are critical. These values hold little currency. I mean, they would be pointless if there is no buy-in from the government. So at least Canada does try that. But how far does it go? I'm just going to go back a little bit. No, before I do that, actually, now Lenton, of course, continues to argue that multicultural policy has the direct result of shifting towards culture as opposed to race. And this is interesting. This actually, the reason why I asked the question right at the beginning was, if we believe we are multicultural, we are also buying into a kind of an understanding that race has been relegated to a background. Now we are concerned about different cultures and how those different cultures are going to come together. So Lenton says that shifting towards a culture as opposed to race, with the ultimate outcome being the evolution of a state of racelessness. And I'm sure a lot of you have already heard this, that um, and I'll be talking a little bit more about later on about the color blindness. But interestingly, the racelessness, as if we have willed ourselves not to see different and the contested notion of a race, but also the oppressions that different races actually experience. Now, such a state obviates the anti-racist efforts that are necessary precondition for securing rights for all members of our society. That is the foundation on which anti-racist policies or even our struggles and our strategies have to function. But if we have obviated that, then of course we've already taken the power out of it, the ability to do something out of it. Adopting multicultural approaches that prioritize culture, religious, or ethno-racial identity may effectively alienate the targets of racism by reinforcing binary notions of identity within a community, uh, potentially focusing on the exotic. And for that, I like the reference to the samosa and the sushi. So now multiculturalism has become a celebration of the exotic, celebration of foods, celebration of dances or ethnic dresses. But it is through those celebrations, we are also forgetting or actually obviating or obfuscating what anti-racist strategies we really had to adopt, or how actively we had to become participants in that. Okay. Now, we also have to remember that Canada is a Eurocentric nation with laws and systems structured in a way to benefit those that fit into this description. So yes, what I'm pointing towards are the images of the samosa and sushi on my screen. And you must be thinking I'm almost behaving like Trump, trying to, um, swatting flies. But anyways, so what we are trying to, a lot of times I have experienced this, and I'm sure many of you as well, people who look brown or black like me. I meant to say black or brown like me, the other way around. Pardon me. This language is my second language. Um, anyways, and I'm also slightly dyslexic. Anyway, is the idea about looking at me and talking about South Asian food or how I love Indian food. Those are well and good. I mean, of course, a lot of South Asians would feel proud that yes, you are enjoying this. A lot of East Asians would feel proud of the fact that yes, Chinese food has overtaken the West, or the Thai food, or even Vietnamese food. All of these things are great. I mean, they are a part of that mosaic. But when we have those conversations, we also have to remember that in a given space of conversations, certain very important conversations then do not find that equal amount of oxygen or space. In 1965, John Porter, and I'm sure a lot of you might have read about that or come across that terminology, where he talked about the vertical mosaic. And he did, it was an extensive study, and his study actually explained the hierarchical nature of Canada's class system, where people who had access to education, who had access to um, wealth, and all of those attendant abilities, they were able to, I mean, those people and their kids actually were able to advance better in Canada. So it was very vertically situated, that class system, except for between, I would say it was between in 70s or early 80s, when that vertical mosaic began to disrupt a little bit, when we had women's equality rights and there was some amount of lateral movement. But in 1998, Helms, Hayes, and Curtis actually went back to this book and they called it Vertical Mosaic Revisited. And they recognized by that time that, and we've been talking about this aspect a lot, that the one on top, that is the 1% of people in the top 1% of people in Canada, and the bottom 99% or even 90% of people in Canada, yes, there were different classes that they belonged to, but the disparity grew a whole lot. I mean, it just went into two different directions. They became richer, and the ones under 90%, they were getting, uh, um, I mean, their debt was rising, their opportunities were shrinking. However, when around mid 1980s and or a little later, when the whole conversation around multiculturalism started to infiltrate into our institutions and in our policy making, there was the traditional view of ethnic differences, the idea of that vertical mosaic, that was disappearing. Now, this is borne out also by the economic disparity between persons of European heritage. And why I'm talking about this is that the newcomers who came from Europe and the ones who came from Africa and Asia did not end up having almost similar outcomes 10 years later. So this vertical mosaic was disrupted, and what actually ended up happening was what we call uh, is a colored mosaic. It is a mosaic that is color coded in such a way that people coming into Canada from Africa and from Asia took longer to to get to a certain level, despite having higher qualifications, than people coming from Europe. So there was a color coding within multiculturalism that was taking place. As I said, I'm just going to be mentioning a little bit of everything. Otherwise, we are going to be, it's already 2 o'clock. And I'm just going to touch a few things further before I do want to have at least half an hour for conversations where there are question and answer sessions, or we can all actually exchange ideas. Now, the other term that actually fed into multiculturalism is postmodernism. This morning, the professor did mention a few things that actually come from we take those terminologies or the ideas from postmodernism. It's a very highly contested space. I'm sorry, when I talk too much and talk too fast, I get very thirsty. Now, postmodernism is, and with all these terms that I will be talking about today, actually, they are co opted by right wing extreme ideologies, and they are also co opted by militant left wing ideologies. I'm just using the word militant, I think, more to satisfy people who believe that there are some things that are called left wing extremism. I don't. If you think that I haven't shown myself in such a way, I mean, I very proudly wear my Marxist credentials. So, anyways, coming back to how these terms have been co-opted. So, I also want to caution that when I critique multiculturalism or postmodernism or post-coloniality, I do want you to understand that we should not fall in the trap of spewing what right-wing ideologies would like to talk about. Number one, postmodernism is responsible for understanding the multi in multiculturalism. Do we live up to it? We don't. So it is non-essentialist. There is nothing essentialist in the meanings that we give. There is no one single meaning that we can attribute to things. It disrupts identity. It um, allows for fluidity of power and multiplicity of centers of power. Now, post-colonialism and feminisms with a plural are, I mean, they owe their origin to the postmodernist thinking. So, and also the idea of intersectionality comes from a postmodernist thinking. So, therefore, when we critique postmodernism, we have to, or anything for that matter, we have to keep in mind what came out of it and in what direction did it go. Especially, for the past 5 or 6 months, I've seen so many articles talking about postmodernism and actually saying that Trump is a result of this postmodernist state. I don't know how to actually read that or understand that because we are still in a very contested, I mean, we don't even know if we understand when we reached a modernist ideology or a state, or if we all agree on what is what is modernist, to actually go to the postmodernist level because of the whole concept of within postmodernism of simulacra, that is an alternate. I mean, of course, it doesn't mean that, but this is what a lot of popular culture critics have started looking at it, that means alternate reality. It is not an alternate reality. It means that there are different ways of entering reality. And then we have our very own Professor Peterson, I think Jordan Peterson is his name, the psychology professor from the University of Toronto, who loves to bash postmodernism. So, why I'm telling you all of these things is that while we critique that, let's not fall into that trap. Now, the basic idea of postmodernism was popularized by Lyotard in 1979 in his book called The Postmodern Condition. And that, I mean, he called that we have reached the end of what we call meta narratives, or also some of them as false meta narratives. That meant that there was not any longer any single dominant account of the world. This is where a lot of other critiques come in. So it's not so much that these accounts previously explained the world, or that there's this one dominant explanation of how the world exists. It doesn't do that. His point was that the world had become too fragmented and pluralistic to support anything like a moral or a social consensus. And this is where my critique of postmodernism comes in, because if we do not have that moral consensus, and I'm sure a lot of us are struggling with this, because there is constantly this struggle between, oh, we don't have to, I mean, I don't want to be politically correct, because in some ways postmodernism does give us this liberty of questioning everything. And therefore the whole idea of that there is a political correctness that we can question. Well, political correctness as a terminology comes from a conservative thinking or more traditionalist thinking, which said, well, I don't believe that I should be anti-racist, but my belief is my personal. But just when I'm speaking to people of color or somebody else, then I'm going to put on this visage of political correctness and then use the terms to kind of assuage or not offend people. The thing about political correctness is that it doesn't allow us to actually take that screen away and question things. I digress. Anyways, coming back to the idea of that there is no moral or social consensus, that anything that anybody is trying to say, it goes. I mean, that is how things are going to be, actually takes us away from the anti-racist agenda. Now, none of our stories about history and justice, and for Lyotard, in his book, the the postmodernist condition, all ideologies are stories which could make any claim of superiority over others. So no one story claims superiority over the other, and they can all coexist. Now, this is the element that we do not see in our multiculturalism, because within multiculturalism, what we see is that we still have a dominant story of a European Canada, but all the other stories have to fit into that narrative. And therefore, the samosa has to become more Canadian now. That means technically saying less spicy. And sushi has been again North Americanized or whatever. I mean, I made up a term. Anyways, before I digress too much. So, some key postmodern thinkers reveled in the ideas destabilizing power and opened the door to questioning the very notion of objective knowledge. And this is where, again, the right wing comes in and says, well, there is no objective knowledge, and you can have QAnon conspiracy theories, and you can have these absolutely outlandish conspiracy theories, because they are trying to say that this is where um, you know you cannot hold on to anything that can be known as an objective truth. But we fall prey actually to this kind of both co-opting most on postmodernism when they have to talk about these conspiracy theories, and also bashing it. So we have Jordan Peterson. His whole aim is that this is a postmodernist agenda for, and he calls the Marxists and the the notion of being politically correct as a postmodernist agenda. And he says, because of that, because we don't have objective truth, our young men are suffering. So they co-opt postmodernism and bash postmodernism at the same time, therefore muddling it for how we actually use the non-essentialist, disruptive possibilities within postmodernism in multiculturalism. Again, this is I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on postcolonialism. That image in itself actually defines postcolonialism, except for one simple statement about this. Postcoloniality, I mean, it came into focus a lot because of Mohanty, Gayatri Spivak Chakravarti, and Edward Said. All of them non-white, two of them from South Asian heritage, one Egyptian. However, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and even USA to some extent started actually taking on the mantle of being a post-colonial nation. There is a huge difference. The reason, I mean, the whole idea of post-colonial identity was to decolonize identities. We didn't decolonize identities. Canada, like Australia and New Zealand, are actually white nations where they brutally pushed the native communities onto reserves and then asked everybody else, while celebrating post-coloniality, asking everybody else to become as European as them, as possible. And I always use my own example as the best example of the post-colonial dilemma. Why do I use my example as the best example of post-colonial dilemma is that I came to Canada about 14 years ago. I taught English in India for 20 years. I went to a convent, and I don't remember ever being able to dream in my own, and I can't even call it the language of my unconscious. I haven't dreamt in my mother's language. Having conversations with my mother, I cannot use Punjabi in its purest form because I don't have words for that. Have I been decolonized or have I been fully colonized? I actually am a living contradiction of using my master's language to the 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 fullest extent, and probably also using it to, as the Marxists would say, to destabilize the ideologies of the ruling class. Again, I digress. Moving on to the next slide, neoliberalism. Thanks to Thatcher and Reagan, I mean, of course, this neoliberal agenda started a long time ago, and that's why I just have the agenda over there. It started a long time ago, but it was really, really popularized by Margaret Thatcher and Reagan. And we are still continuing to suffer the consequences of their popularity and of us falling prey to that kind of a scam, which is called trickle down. We continue using that, especially in Canada. And I would hopefully be able to talk about why we are so stuck on and also buy into the argument of economic migrants into this country. Now, in its most conspicuous and violent form, racism was manifested in the European capitalist development when large number of Africans were shipped to the Americas as slave labor in mines, in sugar, in tobacco, in cotton plantations. Colonial interventions were justified through a discourse of civilizing mission. And I would be remiss if I don't mention the missionaries that went into Africa so that they could control the savages, that they could civilize these savages. Again, I am a product of those missionaries. After these conspicuously violent historical moments, but more specifically after the Holocaust and the genocide during the Second World War, thank you, the civil rights movement in the USA and the liberation or anti-colonial movements in the colonies, Africa and Asia specifically, racism has seemingly been forced into obscurity and invisibility. Now, and a part of that colonization project, and also the part of the 19th century anthropology and science in those times was that race was considered as a biological, it was scientifically thought to be a definition from biology. Now, of course, uh, race as a biological category was abandoned by UNESCO in 1951 and 1952. They then defined race as a cultural construct. And then, of course, it began in Europe, a project, and other Eurocentric countries having gone back to their original nature as non-racist. So what happened by taking away, I mean, not taking away, but of course, by showing that it is not a scientific definition, race is a cultural concept. But once that happened, the neoliberalism actually took that to self-congratulate the Eurocentric or the European countries or the white countries to think that they are now a raceless countries. Because if race doesn't exist as a biological term, and if it is only a cultural construct, then of course we don't see color. That is the most interesting thing about this definition, is that it actually took the wind out of anti-racism. And another thing that happened in the aftermath of the Second World War was the focus on the Holocaust was used to explicitly obliterate European colonial history. A lot of media attention and historical attention and even historical research now focused on the Holocaust, but it would, I mean, suddenly the whole colonial history of Europe and what the Dutch and the British and the Spaniards and the French did in the colonies, that was not being talked about as much. In addition, the shift of the discourse to cultural forms of racism in many European countries, including Canada, has managed to obliterate the biological notion of of race from the public sphere, therefore making it difficult to bring discussion of racism into public arena. And again, something that was discussed this morning, and when Avi asked that question, that it's a lot easier to talk about racism in USA than it is in Canada. We have this, you know, I mean, and I'll be absolutely honest, and I'm gonna that I say that to my own family in USA. I tell them how racist they are, what a rotten nation they have, what a problem, what problems they are facing because of Trump. That we don't want to actually recognize that it happens in Canada as well. Probably only in a politer way, in microaggressions, but it is very much here. So, thus, the neoliberal restructuring and silencing of racism has resulted in an ideology of colorblindness, as I was mentioning earlier, which makes racism even more invisible because it removes any suggestion of white supremacy or white guilt from personal thought and public discussion, while legitimizing the existing social, political, and economic arrangements which privilege whites. Yes, more recently, I would say just in about a year and a half, all of these things have come back into our consciousness, as I mentioned right in the beginning. Why would we need to see a video like that of a person being killed so brutally for us to recognize the structural inequalities or the systemic racism? Those who have been talking about it, the others have been just brushing it aside. Another 5 minutes, and I think then I can really open it to question and answer. Um, my technical team, John, are you there? I don't see you.
I am here. There is
All
no,
right. So, any questions so far?
no questions. If there is
All
any
right. So you
participants,
will be the one who will actually let me know, when I close it about the questions, or we can shut the slides down and I can then have a look at the question answers.
that is correct. That's what I will do.
All right. Thank you very much. That's awesome. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes. So, so colorblind racism is just the ideological cover for a covert and institutionalized system for maintenance of white privilege without identifying those subjected to, excuse me, or those rewarded by that system. At the same time, this ideology insinuates that class and culture, rather than institutional racism, are responsible for social inequality. Even though race and racism may, in the context of color blindness, be denied or ignored, migrants are readily available. I mean, the most racialized category are nonetheless blamed for the negative impact of those structural transformations on the general population. Now, I would again interject this morning's conversation about othering, that other space is empty and it is only filled up and made more dangerous once we kind of, and it's a lot of projection. That projection also comes from an element of how neoliberalism, with this whole, and I've skipped a lot of that aspect about neoliberalism, how that economic disparity between 95% of our population and 5%. So the angst of economic anxiety has then been, I mean, and that being used by those who want to remain in power to actually then use that angst and anger and fill up that jar of othering, that other jar that he was talking about this morning. So, as a result of global neoliberalism, the global south, and particularly the African continent, even in the aftermath of colonialism, and they are the ones who are actually providing us, they are the main suppliers of raw material. So, all of that we are building right now, we still continue to get that raw material from African nations, but we want them subjugated in this neoliberal structure where, of course, the power is now consolidated within the global north. The failure to address the past colonial histories of Europe leads to the dismissal of the present post-colonialism and multiculturalism, or the way these relationships create vulnerabilities. The silence around the past and present exploitative relationships may then explain the way nationalist groups in the global north reason around migrants being the cause of their problems for taking the jobs and welfare meant for the natives. So I will end by saying how the newcomer or the migrant or the immigrant is paradoxically both taking away their jobs as well as being lazy and taking or partaking in social welfare system. I will stop it right here and I will open it up to conversations. John. Thank you very much, Tania, for that question. Really appreciate that. How does racial justice lens inform the work of my agency? Um, We have actually, and I have joined this agency only a year ago, but I will also use the example of my past agency in Windsor. We have constantly been questioning simple things like if we are going to have a potluck or if we are going to have a social gathering, and I'm not just talking about um, with along with the clients, but even with the staff, that if we're going to do that, then we also need to spend some time actually questioning how the how racism impacts those that are being subjugated to that oppression. So it's not only going to be a samosa or an Indian food party, but we're going to spend about 15 minutes to talk about the pyramid of hatred, or the pyramid that yes, pyramid of hatred. I really hope that answers your question. It's not at all an easy task, trust me. Sometimes I think to be talking too much on a, and Tanya, you would know that I get too philosophical in my conversations, or a little too obscure for my colleagues to actually understand what I'm saying. Okay, on a broader scale, how do you see the role of the settlement sector in perpetuating or disrupting? Yes, absolutely. On a broader scale, I think that the settlement sector, and I wanted to talk about so many things within that. On the settlement sector has a huge responsibility. We cannot be, I don't think we can do justice to our clients or even to the sector that we serve if we are not having policy conversations with the funders, we are not having policy conversations with the private sector, with the corporations, if we are not having anti-racism, and of course Jocelyn's question around pyramid of hatred, thank you very much for bringing it up, because if we are not talking about the simple biases or the unconscious biases, or and Jocelyn, I'm answering your question while I'm responding to Tanya as well, is that if we do not challenge, question, understand, and disseminate the pyramid of hatred, which starts from unconscious bias to to the conscious bias, and goes on till it becomes really a genocide. And I've always given Trump's example of that. For that, if we don't have those conversations as a settlement sector, I think we are doing injustice to our own sector. So we really do need to be at the forefront of having those conversations. So that is why I chose this topic to talk about that. Anybody else? So, Tanya, did I answer that question? I mean, of course, it's not going to be, these are really longer conversations, even an hour and a half. I don't think I was able to kind of cover up a whole lot of things. What are the hierarchical foundations in a nonprofit world as it relates to racial justice? I'm just going to talk about. mm, I started this conversation this morning actually talking about disrupting the that I am the one who has the knowledge as a presenter, and everybody else who are participating in this are just going to be passive listeners. We use those kind of hierarchies with our clients all the time. Um, Tanya, that's what I was hoping for. Again, I'm going to ask John, is there, we really do need to hear everybody else. Is there a way that others can actually, or do they just have to, Jake? Keep calling you John. Jake, is there a way that we could hear other people in this?
Unfortunately not. They are able to respond in the Q&A.
Okay. All right. So, Tanya, yes, I mean, one of the disadvantages of virtual conferences. I mean, I can go on and on. I can talk a lot, but I do want to hear other people. I think I should also just start typing my responses. Anyways, coming back to Jocelyn, what you were saying is Oh, can you hear me?
We
All
can
right.
hear you, Sudhi. Your microphone has been, it's a little staticky. What you could possibly do is unplug and replug back in your microphone, if that's possible.
Oh, yes, I can do that. Can you hear me now?
A lot better, thank you.
Oh, it was just that. I thought, I move a lot. So there was rustling, and I have a jacket that has these metal uh, buttons that might have caused that. So, yeah, Tanya, we can't, unless people are going to type their responses, it's not going to be a conversation. But we should be able to have, again, it's going to be typed the marketplace or where we do the networking. I was really hoping to hear other people tell me what creative ways have they found out in disrupting all of these things, because we talk about anti-racism but we don't go to the root cause of all the other concurrent philosophies that are around that continue leading to the perpetuate. I mean, this question that Justin asked about the hierarchical foundations, that actually has its roots in the Enlightenment project, which said that there is probably an objective reason, knowledge, and nothing that can be disrupted out of that. And it also kind of perpetuated the whole notion of the colonial project of we are coming in with knowledge and the others are only going to be the passive recipients. And I am doing exactly that. Thank you so much, Aman. I actually wanted to talk about internalized racism within ethnic groups and especially colorism. Um, so the reason I gave my own example of being a very good colonial subject, learned my master's language, taught my master's language, um, have forgotten really the words from my own language to an extent that, as I was mentioning, I haven't dreamt in my language in a long time. I don't remember when I did that. Um, my conversations with my kids are around a Western culture, and I don't know what. So I'm a so when I take in that language, when I take in that kind of the definition of what is better, I'm also then perpetuating. And when I say I'm perpetuating, I do try to be mindful of that, but I know my group does. I know that it happens in my family. I mean, it was only until very recently that I started telling my mother, stop giving my daughter the fairness cream from India. So you can understand when I talk about the internalized racism. So there are two factors, two very important aspects about internalized racism. We uh, we discriminate based on colorism, and then we also accept aggressions towards us because we believe that that is what we are supposed to, I mean, that is what we deserve, that there is nothing that we can do about it. So it functions in two ways, and it's um, it's a constant struggle. It's a very difficult thing to be able to question and to be able to actually get out of that internalized racism. In fact, Tanya, your very first question around how do I practice that? So, having those conversations with my own staff and with our clients, they're not easy conversations. This was one of the first things that I was talking about with a lot of my South Asian staff and clients was the internalized racism and how we looked up to what we thought was the Eurocentric as the ideal belief, and also how we do not sometimes listen to the truths of what the other cultures might be saying, because we've already said that this is Canada, this is how you're going to behave, this is how you're going to get a job, and this is how you should behave to be able to get that job. Am I missing anybody else's question? Okay. The terminology used in the settlement sector is very defined, and it seems that we are trying to fit a newcomer. Thank you. Thank you. I think you should be the one, Sadia. I hope Sadia Akram, I'm saying your pronouncing your name right. Absolutely, you should be the one responding to a lot of these questions. Justing the equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I'm going to. I was sent a picture this morning to help me with my presentation, and that picture was an image of a table. So I'm actually going to. I'll just cheat. I'll tell you what that picture was. So yes, the picture says diversity is having a seat at the table. Decolonization is breaking the table apart to make a sweat lodge fire and bringing everyone in. I can repeat that, or if you want, I can actually type that in. If somebody is a good typer, can actually type that in. Diversity is having a seat at the table. Decolonization is breaking the table apart to make a sweat lodge fire and bringing everyone in. And again, we'll have to caution ourselves when we say that we are going to make a sweat lodge fire. It's we have to be mindful when it comes to appropriation of other cultures, because we are not invited. We are uninvited, although not unwelcome. So we have to be mindful of that. How would you? Okay. Uh, so anybody else? I mean, if you're not going to ask too many questions, I could go to. I mean, I can go back to reading all those papers that I had flipped across, and go back to having very, very dense conversations. But I'm enjoying this a lot more. Cannot see the questions written here. Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry, Tanya. Um, I didn't know that you guys could not see the questions written here. All right, so let's go to what Sadia says. It seems that we need to look into the terminology and structures to give a meaningful sense of participation and inclusion to newcomers. I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. We need to look into terminology and structures, and also I believe in disrupting those structures constantly, because if we um, the worst state is when we get so used to certain things. I mean, it's almost like, and I'm going to give an example from my teaching time when I used to teach structuralism and post structuralism to my students. I would give the example of the traffic lights. And I said, what is it about a red light that actually tells you is essentially telling you to stop? We get so habituated, we get so used to looking at a red light telling us that, okay, we have to stop, that we are actually going through intersections after intersections almost unconsciously, because they've become a part of our nature. And if we don't question those, that is exactly what you said, Sadia, that if we do not change the terminology and structures, it loses meaning, and we unconsciously begin to live in a state of complacency. And that complacency is the worst thing to happen when we should constantly be, which we call is active equity or active anti racist agenda. Right. So Tanya says that yes, and that is absolutely right. To share your ideas via the public chat in the bottom right corner of the screen. So there is a Q&A and there is a public chat. I'm just going to type, hi, can you see this? No, this is only for mine. Right. Somebody asked a question about lateral violence and anti-black racism in our sector. Maria had asked a question that I don't see right now. It was about lateral violence and anti-black racism within our sector. I'm going to give you actually, oh, okay, it's in feed loop. Right now, I'm going to actually tell you a true story of overhearing a colleague of mine. I'm not going to say where it was, but that would really tell you how prevalent lateral violence is within our sector. This colleague said, and they're talking about clients, you know that, and we were talking about expanding, providing support such as transportation. And in a group of literally like 15, 20 people, this person says, you know that our clients lie and cheat. No, the exact phraseology was they are liars and cheaters. How does somebody, and of course, there was a privilege in that person, in that colleague of mine. The privilege was that this person did not come from um, Asian countries or African countries, just because most of our clients were coming in from Asia and Africa, that you can go ahead and make a statement like that. So, yes, there is a lot of prevalence of lateral violence and anti Black racism to the extent that actually some of our, I know in an agency that a client refused services from a Black colleague. And this client did not come from Europe, actually came from one of the Asian countries. So yes, and nobody within the agency actually stepped in to have a conversation around it. But then, of course, that was a learning moment for all of us to have those conversations. It's a slow, tedious process. I would be interested to hear your thoughts, analysis about how your business models incorporated into social service organizations reinforce hierarchies and racism, especially as they reflect capitalist values. Also, notice increasing emphasis on avoiding risk in human service organizations. I believe this focus very much works against disrupting dominant discourses. Similarly, I wonder if service organizations need also to resist current ways of evaluating services and outcomes in ways that ignore anti racist work. Hope this absolutely makes sense. Yes, I mean, you're talking my language. Anyways, can you share some of your thoughts to address these structures to increase the functionality and participation of individuals and newcomers? Uh, I do want to have a conversation where I can give concrete examples. So let's talk about being risk averse. Let's talk about being, avoiding risk in human service organizations from the perspective of the capitalist agenda, which is, and I'm so sorry, Tanya, I know the funders do have um, to keep us accountable, and we also have to be accountable. But a lot of this work actually means that we do not have the capacity, or sorry, not the capacity, we do not have the freedom to be able to do certain things which we know at that point of time are more suitable for what our clients need. Now, and I'm going to use IRCC's example at this point. There are certain things given to us by IRCC that this is the eligibility criteria for our clients. These are the services that you can provide. But ultimately, the ultimate goal for our client is economic success. Now, that economic success is a direct result of the capitalist agenda. And that is why I said there was a whole lot of things around neoliberalism that I wanted to talk about, that we have actually started viewing our clients as commodities. A commodities within a capitalist functioning where we prepare them, polish them, find them jobs. Of course, they are much lower than the qualifications that they actually have, and then put them out in the capitalist world to be able to provide. I mean, get into the whole rigmarole of uh, earning wage, getting a house, and stuff like that. We have stopped viewing our newcomer clients or the individuals they're as human beings. So of course, the participation, if we were to ask them, even they come in, and that is, it's not internalized racism, but that is internalized oppression. Because when you come in as an economic immigrant, then you are also thinking at an unconscious level that this is your role that you have to perform within Canada, that there is nothing else, that Canada somehow did you a favor by allowing you to come into Canada as an economic immigrant, and therefore you have to fulfill that role and be able to say thank you back to Canada and never uh, really have that ownership. So, the question this morning around belonging, this sense of belonging, when you come together to co collaborate, to co create, that never happens. And therefore, there is this whole ghettoization of newcomers within a multicultural country. So you can have Scarborough where you can get Caribbean food, and there is a certain section of Scarborough where you can get Filipino food, and ghettoization of that. But it's not co creation because they are also now within that whole system of the capitalist agenda to be able to, um, work and able to pay their taxes so that they don't fall on the social service beneficiary sector. I mean, the not the social service, but the, anyways, I forgot the terminology. The social security. Right, Sadia, you're right. Newcomers are coming from a different structure and fitting into a different culture. It needs synchronization of so much information. I wouldn't say synchronization because, again, one of the things that I wanted to talk about when I was talking about multiculturalism and its debt to postmodernism in talking about plurality and multiness. That means there are that a lot of different things can coexist at the same time. So yes, they get confused because we are trying to synchronize it. It is not an effort on our part to synchronize. There is because it is a virtual world a lot more now. It is going to become increasingly virtual. Even the funders are going to start talking about hybrid modes. So there is going to be a virtual reality that is going to be viewed from different perspectives, but also have some kind of a universalistic um, um, aspect to it, which I don't know how much of that can be true. However, in that universalized, dehumanized virtual world, yes, they can have something that we can say we all share together. But on the other hand, real synchronization never happens, it never takes place. Because that would mean, um, I mean, when I see terminology like that, newcomers are coming from a different structure, fitting into a different culture. needs synchronization of so much information that they get confused. Uh, uh, that reminds me of when uh, assimilation was the byword before we started talking about multiculturalism. So, yeah, the example of someone telling lies is um, it wasn't just telling lies. They said they are all liars and cheaters. So, all liars and cheaters is a fairly mm, broad statement to make about 200, 300 clients. Do you think that this is a challenge between structures slash assimilation? Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's a challenge. I mean, we can't have assimilation, and assimilation to what? Did European countries, both, I mean, from Great Britain and France, the original occupiers of Canada, did they assimilate to native cultures? They did not. They actually ruled over them. And of course, we know the indigenous history. There are too many other things too. So, why are we asking other newcomers to come in and talk about assimilation? So, yes, there has to be a challenge, a constant challenge to these structures. Have I missed any questions so far? All right. Okay, I got a 10 minutes warning, but I have now it's 7 minutes. I don't think there are too many people who are asking this, asking too many questions. It is so, I mean, I do talk about this simulacra and all of these things, but literally, I've just been seeing myself and talking to myself this whole time. Not that I don't do it normally, I do it all the time. I do talk to myself, but not for such a long time. I mean, thank you, Sadia. Thank you, Tanya, for actually making it at least. And Maria also, as somebody else mentioned, for at least making me think. And the anonymous attendee. And Jocelyn. I hope I haven't missed anyone, for at least making me think that there are other people somewhere. So, if there are not too many questions, I think Jake, um, Janet, thank you so much. Thank you. I mean, I really hope I didn't get too dense. Um, I wanted to talk about too many things in a shorter period of time, and that is a disadvantage. And then you don't see the faces. I don't know if you're yawning, and then I can throw in something else. We should engage newcomers with racial justice conversations. Um, you know, just remember one thing, um, and I'm glad that actually IRCC has started using that, especially with NARS. It's talking about needs assessment and abilities of our newcomers. Remember, newcomers have agency, newcomers have knowledge, um, and we need to value that knowledge. Second, we cannot actually start a conversation again from the perspective of either a lecture that it is something that we are trying to teach you, which we normally do a lot of times when we are saying, okay, in Canada, the laws are like this. In Canada, you cannot hit your wife, or there can't be, spousal abuse. In Canada, we have this justice and stuff like that. I mean, we shouldn't approach any of those topics from that position of power. It should be a conversation, absolutely, but a conversation where also we become, um, you know, we become listeners to what do they have to say, what are their experiences, and you would be amazed, even if in a language class, a conversation around around racial justice started happening, and just asking them what were their opinions um, about police killings, or what is their opinion um, on fishing rights for the indigenous communities in Nova Scotia. Let's have those conversations. In fact, one of the things that I really wanted to talk about was, and I thought could be a practical example, is that every LINC class should have a little bit of these conversation sections around the current events and how do they impact our clients. A lot of our mm, the PBLA and CLP curriculum is already preset, and we are within the mindset of that we have to finish all the modules. Why can't we introduce things that are happening concurrently? Why can't we have a conversation around first Black National Party leader that was elected by the Greens, and she is from Toronto? What is your experience around that? Or why can't we have and I did actually write down the correct pronunciation for the Mi'kmaq, the indigenous communities from Nova Scotia. What are their fishing rights? What treaties were signed? So let's have conversations around that. And that I think is very, very doable in our language classes. Just once a month, anything that is a recent topic. And you will be amazed by the input that you will get. Interestingly, a lot of our newcomers are more politically active than we actually give them credit for. They come from countries where their participation within their democracies or non-democracies is their awareness is far greater than what we have in the West right now. And Jake, I've been keeping an eye on time. 2 minutes left. Any other question? All right. If there are no more questions, I think before Jake kicks us all out of this, I'm going to say thank you very much. It's a strange experience not seeing anybody and just, you know, trying to rush through a whole lot of things. Anybody wants to have a longer conversation? I work at Settlement Assistance Family Support Services. My contact information will also be with my probably when you signed up for this session, you would see that. And this session is being recorded, and I will send as much of my contact information as they will allow me to. So you can keep in touch with me. Thank you. Thank you very much.